So what comes to mind when you think of the Protestant Reformation? Not that I believe it's on the front burner, but I wonder what comes to mind. Let's say, should someone invite you to think about the Protestant Reformation, you would probably dig deep into the cloudy reservoir of memory and come up with some names, Martin Luther, John Calvin. You would recall that these former reformers set out to change the doctrines and rituals of the Catholic Church and most fundamentally move Christianity out from under any papal influence. The Protestant Reformation obviously did not have the social networking services that make present-day reformations like the Arab Spring far more accessible to a global audience. Though lacking the ability to text and Twitter, and the absence of Facebook to update the world on all matters in a heartbeat, the Protestant Reformation kept pace through their own resourceful use of the printing press. It was as indispensable to them as the iPhone is to us. The real troubling aspect of the Protestant Reformation was the bloodshed that spilled freely because of a person's belief. I'm not talking about beliefs of a seditious variety, but simply one's ideas about God and how to worship God. People risked their lives to exercise their beliefs, and people died if they abandoned their faith or changed their faith and became labeled as apostates. Ministers were dragged from pulpits and beaten, sometimes to death, if they offered religious ideas that were a little less conforming to that of their church members. Frankly, if I were alive back then, I would have opted for another profession. Maybe I'd try being a goldsmith or something like that. Now, as many of us probably already know, the Unitarian king of Transylvania, King John Sigismund, wrote the Edict of Tolerance for his kingdom in 1567, hailed as a remarkable accomplishment to end the lunacy of murdering people on religious grounds. It did not really lessen the antipathy between different believers, but at least it reduced the bloodshed. The experiment in tolerance was short-lived. The king had the indecency to die at a young age, and so the Calvinists regained power. The king's Unitarian preacher spent the rest of his life in a dungeon for forsaking the Trinity, and religious intolerance seized Transylvania once again. So I think in a nutshell, that's probably what most of us would think of when asked to recall the Protestant Reformation. But there was another Protestant Reformation that occurred in our own country. In 1689, we had what is known as the Protestant Reformation in the early colonial province of Maryland. Here's what happened, and I assure you that popes played a crucial role. Catholics began arriving in the province of Maryland in 1634 as Lord Baltimore intended to create a haven for English Catholics. Lord Baltimore was a convert to Catholicism, a dangerous move, where in 17th century England, Roman Catholics were considered enemies of the crown and traitors to the country, thanks to the schism created by Henry VIII, but that's a whole different story. The issue on the table for both Protestant Reformations was religious freedom. Competing views of truth drew blood and created violence. Now, in Maryland, 1649, the province passed the Maryland Toleration Act. Sounds downright liberal. almost Transylvanian in its texture. But there's one caveat. It mandated religious tolerance only for Trinitarian churches. Is there any wonder I'm beginning to develop this persecution complex? I don't know, maybe you too. Puritan rebels in Maryland seized control of the province. John Coode led the Protestant rebellion that expelled Lord Baltimore, establishing a new government that excluded Catholics. In order for Charles Calvert V, Baron of Baltimore, to take control of the whole province, he had to swear publicly that he was a Protestant. So Catholics were not only out of any kind of political power, they were not allowed to exercise their faith in Maryland. Full tolerance of their beliefs was not restored until the Declaration of Independence about 83 years after the Protestant Reformation in Maryland. Now, the early settlers, as we all learned in grade school, came to these shores in pursuit of religious freedom. But what did that mean for them? They sought not a certain tolerance of differing religious views. They came instead to create their own religious establishment that would link their beliefs to the state, thereby excluding those whose beliefs differed. In the Massachusetts Bay Colony, Roger Williams, a leading supporter of religious freedom through the separation of church and state, was sent packing. Well, he ultimately established the first Baptist church in the whole country in Providence, Rhode Island. William Penn, another great supporter of religious freedom, was excluded and ultimately established a Quaker government in Philadelphia. Protests erupted in the southern part of that territory known as Delaware, and Delaware actually seceded. Mary Dyer, a Quaker, in an act of civil disobedience, returned to Boston to defy the rules that expelled Quakers. She was hanged in Boston with 3 other Quakers in 1660. Why were Quakers such a threat and virtuous Puritans ready to kill them? Because Quakers believed that God spoke directly to individuals rather than through the clergy. Well, I joined the Boston clergy 315 years after Mary Dyer was hanged. I'll tell you, they're still a pretty crusty group. Got to be careful with them. Don't forget the Salem witch trials, in which 19 were hanged, and that occurred 30 years after Mary Dyer. Now, horrific historical facts aside, I cannot help but wonder about human nature. Disturbing for me is not just the insensitivity towards the beliefs, the sacred beliefs of fellow human beings, but that we are incapable of learning from our own experience of oppression. Our early settlers, persecuted for their beliefs in their native countries, fled to the New World, but not with a new heart. They quickly assumed the role of oppressors themselves, with a huge dose of amnesia not to remember the time of their own suffering. Having the power to control the state's decision-making in support of their belief system seemed to them the only way to uphold the moral fibers of society. It was all built on the premise that morality precluded different points of view. Can you imagine that? Morality, to have a solid moral society, precluded differing points of view. Roger Williams argued eloquently that the state had no right to dictate religious practice to its citizens, but it was Jefferson and Madison who drew the line separating church and state as authors of the First Amendment to the Constitution in 1791. But the constitutional right to believe, teach, practice, worship, and observe has hit a landmine in this election year.